Welcome, everybody, to the very first episode of the Precious Aroma Deep Dives. Now, if you're anything like me, at some point you probably started this hobby thinking that this was very simple. You smell something, you like it, you buy it. But then 6 months later, you realize that you have accumulated enough perfumes to equal like a small Honda Civic, right? So that's usually how it goes. But as I've gotten deeper and deeper into the hobby of fragrance, I've realized that some of the stories and history behind the fragrances are sometimes even more interesting than the fragrances themselves. So today we have 3 segments that we're going to be going through. One, we're going to go over a perfume that sparked outrage and boycotts across the world, a perfume ingredient that comes from whale vomit and can cost thousands and thousands of dollars, and the man who helped to create the most famous perfume in history. But before we get started, let's do something that I hope becomes a tradition on these episodes, our scent of the day. So today I am wearing 2 fragrances, one Dama Bianca from Xerjoff, layered with Mykonos milk drops. And if you're listening, I'd love to know what you are wearing today. Please drop your scent of the day in the comment section down below. I love to hear what people are wearing, whether it is Baccarat Rouge 540 or a dupe from TikTok. No judgment here. Just let us know what you're wearing. Now, without further ado, let's get started with our first story. And trust me, this is a juicy one. So I want you to imagine with me. Imagine if you woke up one morning and you heard that a very big, prominent perfume brand like Dior, for example, decided that they were going to be coming out with a perfume named methamphetamine. Not inspired by it, not some, clever play on words, just a straight up perfume named methamphetamine coming to your shelves in a couple of weeks. You'd probably think that someone in their marketing department had completely lost their mind. Well, back in 1977, Yves Saint Laurent pretty much did the exact same thing. Because in 1977, he officially launched the perfume called Opium. And as you can imagine, people went absolutely berserk over this announcement. Now, younger fragrance lovers might be hearing this and thinking, well, what's the big deal, right? Because you're so accustomed to Black Opium, that delicious coffee gourmand perfume that we all love. Doesn't seem like there's anything particularly controversial about Black Opium. But back in 1977, that name carried a lot more weight than it does today. To understand why, we need to go back in time a little bit and familiarize ourselves with what 1977 was like. Back then, most perfume names sounded elegant, refined, safe, or maybe even a little bit bougie, like Chanel No. 5, Rive Gauche, Aromatics Elixir, stuff like that you would expect a perfume to be named after. It was like the fragrance world was just always attending some type of classy, black tie event with how they named and handled their perfume. And then Yves Saint Laurent comes and kicks the door open with Opium. Now, if you know anything about Yves Saint Laurent, this really shouldn't shock you because this man was known to always be a rule breaker. He was constantly trying to push the boundaries in everything that he did. Long before Opium, he was putting women in tuxedos, pushing all different kinds of boundaries in fashion. He challenged mainstream ideas about femininity and luxury. He was never the kind of person who was interested in playing it safe. And that is important because once all the backlash started about the name Opium, I think people forgot that this is not a man who was known to back down just because something is a little bit uncomfortable. Now let's talk about why exactly were people upset about the name Opium. For many people, particularly people in the Chinese communities, the word opium was not some luxury, mysterious, perfume name. It represented something very real and very painful: the Opium Wars. Foreign powers flooding China with opium to get their people addicted and essentially try to crumble their society. We're talking about mass addiction, political turmoil, and generational suffering. Millions of lives were affected from the Opium Wars. So when a luxury, glamorous perfume house or fashion house at that time decides to take that word and put it on, the newest trendy perfume, many people looked at that move as just purely insensitive to what they went through. I mean, imagine if a luxury brand were to name a perfume I don't know, 2020 financial crisis or student loan debt or identity theft. Different phrases, different words carry different meaning and different baggage that can be triggering in some people when they think about the actual association with that word. And opium was definitely one that carried a lot of baggage for those communities. So of course, backlash started quick and heavy. Newspapers were writing about it. Community groups were speaking out against it. Boycott efforts started to happen. People were, criticizing and demanding a name change. Even some retailers started to become nervous about whether or not they should even carry the perfume Opium in their stores when it was officially launched. The fragrance became an absolute news story before anyone had even actually smelled it, which is kind of funny when you think about it. No one's talking about how the perfume smells. We're just talking about the name. The fragrance itself was almost secondary to what people were actually focused on. And then Yves Saint Laurent did something that will go down in history. Instead of apologizing, instead of changing the name, instead of retreating in general, he doubled down. Now, I want you to imagine that we are in a boardroom in 1977 in the Yves Saint Laurent headquarters. And we're talking about all the backlash that the perfume is receiving. I'm sure people are trying to figure out, how do we do damage control? What kind of PR do we need right now? And you've got Yves Saint Laurent just kind of sitting there smirking, thinking. And instead of taking any of the ideas that I'm sure were presented to him, he's thinking, instead of how do we calm this situation down, it's way more interesting and fun to think of how can we capitalize on it and use all of this attention to our benefit. Because instead of backing down, YSL then decides to create one of the biggest, most extravagant luxury launch parties in history. And when I'm talking extravagant, I'm not just talking about like renting a ballroom at the Marriott. No. This man got an actual giant pirate-looking sailing ship to host the Opium launch party on. It was a massive steel-hulled sailing ship that was docked in the harbor in New York. And for that night, and many days after, it became the only thing that the fragrance community could talk about. I mean, imagine an invitation to this party. You're not going to a hotel or anything like that. You're showing up to a crazy looking boat. And on this boat, you have tons of expensive white orchids, beautiful, ornate, Asian-inspired decor, which is incredibly audacious, seeing as how it was the Asian community that was upset with him. Red lanterns, gold accents, Asian-inspired wardrobes and fashion. Like, this man really knew how to just give someone the middle finger. He even had a giant Buddha statue on the boat. It was clear that YSL was making a statement that not only are we not backing down, but we are going to lean into the criticisms. And if you're offended, you're offended. It got to a point where Opium was not just a perfume or a product. It was an event. It was a spectacle. And all of these actions just garnered more and more attention. You had some of the world's biggest billionaires, celebrities, models, fashion editors, all present at this party supporting YSL and his launch. Basically, anyone who mattered in what they considered to be luxury culture was there at the party. Some estimates put the attendance at over 800 people. 800 people on a boat for a perfume launch. Most fragrance houses today can't even get 800 people to leave a comment on a website page. Can you imagine 800 people dropping everything to attend this launch party, knowing how controversial and criticized that move would be? Now, the cost of the party is said to be between $200 to $300, but $200 to $300 in 1977, when adjusted for inflation, would be around $1 million in today's money. That is wild. Imagine explaining to your shareholders, your accountants, that this perfume that people are threatening to boycott, protesting out in the streets, is going to garner a $1 million budget for a big boat party. To say that this was a risky move is an understatement. And just like YSL thought, this move garnered an incredible amount of attention. People could not stop talking about it. Newspapers could not stop reporting about it. And before long, Opium, the perfume, became completely impossible to ignore. In fact, many fragrance historians say that without the controversy that really became part of Opium's identity, they don't know if it would have gone on to become the perfume that it is today. And that's one of the main reasons why we still talk about this perfume over 50 years later. as one of the most iconic perfumes to have ever been created. Now, here's my favorite part. Despite the controversy, despite the criticism, despite the headlines, people still, eventually at the end of the day, had to actually smell the perfume. Because at a certain point, we want to know, all right, but does it actually smell good? And this is where Opium, to me, really lives up to the lore and its notoriety, because the smell itself was every bit as dramatic as the rollout. Imagine walking into a dark room that is lit by candles. You've got some incense burning somewhere in the background. Somebody just served up a tray of spiced plum, and you smell rich resins in the air. Amber, clove, cinnamon, myrrh, vanilla, smoke, sweetness, warmth. Everything about the fragrance feels incredibly bold. Nothing about it is subtle. This is not a polite handshake type of perfume. This is a knocking on your door and kicking it down once you don't come in, let me in about 5 seconds. Like, the perfume is going to enter the room before you do. That's probably also one of the reasons why this perfume became so successful, because the actual aroma of the perfume matched the story. It matched the controversy, it matched the marketing. And most importantly, it matched Yves Saint Laurent himself. Everything felt intentional, everything felt larger than life, which honestly is probably the part that frustrated critics the most, because a lot of people thought that this perfume was going to completely fail. From the beginning, when they launched the name and how much backlash it got, to the fact that Yves Saint Laurent doubled down and just angered people even more. It was like it was one offense after another, and no one thought that the average consumer was going to want to, support that. They could not have been more wrong though, because in spite of all of the negative headlines, within its first year, Opium quickly became one of the best-selling fragrances of all time. We're talking millions of dollars in sales. Department stores could barely keep it in stock, customers could not stop talking about it, and all of a sudden, people started to look at Yves Saint Laurent not as just a provocateur, but more of a marketing genius. Now, to be fair, I personally don't think that anyone was sitting in that boardroom and thought, you know what, today, we're going to make a perfume and intentionally try to offend people to sell a lot of bottles. I think they went with a name that they knew would be provocative, but probably not garnish the level of backlash that it received. But once they were presented with a fork in the road, whether to back down or continue on with their mission, they decided that any kind of attention, be it positive or negative, is still good publicity. Because in spite of what we may think is right, I think we all know the old saying of when it bleeds, it leads. We as people, consumers, etc., tend to pay more attention to negativity. And so if you have something that has a whole bunch of controversy around it, yeah, you are going to get the name and the idea of whatever that product is in front of the consumer a lot more effectively than you would if you had a happy rainbow, everyone loves puppies type of campaign. We've seen that happen over and over and over again in history, not just in the perfume industry. Yves Saint Laurent and Opium is just one very good example of that. Now, what's also funny is as the years continue to go on with Opium, stories started to emerge of packages being delayed or confiscated due to the name Opium being on the box. Some of these stories are difficult to verify if they're 100% accurate, that people were, confiscating opium bottles thinking that they were actually filled with tons of drugs as opposed to perfume. But all of these stories just added to the lore of Opium itself. People would be sharing stories about seeing customs agents with boxes that had the word opium on it and, looking very concerned. Whether or not it's true almost doesn't matter. People just love the thrill of a good story, a good legend, a good myth. And at this point, Opium had definitely become more than just a fragrance. It had become an absolute cultural phenomenon. And it also probably helped that back in 1977, people were really into just a lot of excess things at that time culturally. Big hair, big fashion, big personalities, big luxury. And Opium fit in with that overall expectation. This wasn't a clean musk that we all love today. This wasn't an office-friendly type of scent. This was a beast mode, crazy sillage, incredibly complex, choke you out if you stand too close to me type of scent. Now, if we fast forward a little bit in time, One of the biggest misconceptions about opium is that the black opium that we currently have on our shelves, in most department stores, is the same as the original opium, and that is not accurate. Black opium did not arrive until decades later, and while it definitely became successful in its own right, it is a completely different fragrance from the original opium. Black opium gives you coffee, vanilla, sweetness. It's a much more modern take on that DNA. It's very easy to wear and a lot more muted in comparison to the original Oriental powerhouse that was the original opium. People are still torn on how they feel about opium and its launch in general. Some people feel like Yves Saint Laurent is an absolute marketing genius. Some people think that he's a complete insensitive jerk. What I think is that regardless of which side you may be on, what can't be ignored is that this perfume and its launch and everything around it made people feel something. For some people, that was hatred, and for other people, that was complete joy and excitement. And in a crowded fragrance marketplace, that is an impressive feat. What I will ask you is, do you think that if someone were to launch a perfume as provocative as Opium today with that type of launch, how do you think that it would do in 2026? Do you think that it could still find the same success? Or do you think that the way that we are now, we would just completely cancel that? Let me know in the comment section down below. Now, let's move on to our second segment. Now, I know what you're thinking. We just spent some time talking about a very scandalous controversy. How are we going to top that? Very simply, we are going to top that by talking about whale vomit. Now, before you X out of this video and start questioning your subscription choices, let me explain. Because to me, this is one of the most interesting and strangest fragrance scientific fun facts, but it is 100% true and accurate. Let's dive into the ingredient ambergris and explain how exactly this comes from whale vomit. So ambergris comes from the vomit of sperm whales, which is already an incredibly weird sentence, but stay with me. So sperm whales love to eat giant squid, and giant squid have beaks. And these beaks are very hard and they are very sharp. And apparently whales are not able to digest the beaks very well, which sounds like a design flaw if you ask me, but that's neither here nor there. Over time, what happens is all of those giant squid beaks can understandably irritate the whale's stomach lining. So scientists believe that over the years, evolution, that whales created this waxy substance in their stomach to be able to protect them from the irritating squid beak. And eventually that material, that waxy material, gets expelled from the whale's body. Now here's where things get a little bit disgusting. That expelled material initially from the whale smells absolutely terrible, all right? Like funk on funk on funk. Not luxury, not elegance, not anything that anybody would want to put into a perfume. But then something incredibly magical happens. The ambergris, which is the material that is expelled by the whale, floats in the ocean for years, sometimes decades. It deals with sunlight, with ocean water, with oxidation, time in general. And the material slowly starts to transform and becomes a smell that is like nothing else. A little sweet, a little warm, musky, oceanic, animalic, complex, mysterious. Perfumers became absolutely obsessed with it when they discovered it. And once you understand what ambergris actually does in fragrance, you realize why they're so obsessed with it, because it's not just about the smell. It's about its magical ability to act as a fixative. AKA, it can make perfumes last longer. It helps to smooth out rough edges, it helps to add radiance to the overall perfume, and it just makes your scent feel more alive. Think of it like adding butter to a recipe. It's not always the star of the meal, but it helps to make everything else just taste better. Now here's the crazy part. For hundreds of years, even after they started to use ambergris in perfumery, they still didn't know where the hell it was coming from. People were finding pieces of it just washing up on beach shores with no idea as to what exactly they were looking at. Some people thought that it was coming from dragons, some people thought that it was coming from volcanoes. And so sometimes people would find these random lumps that almost look like rocks and just throw them back into the ocean, not realizing that they have something that is worth thousands and thousands of dollars in their hand. But eventually, scientists were able to build the whale connection and figure out what exactly it was. But by that point, it was already one of the most prized materials in perfumery, and not just for perfumers, because royalty loved it. queens loved it, kings loved it. Some historical records suggest that people were even adding it to their food. Some people burned it, some people carried it around as a status symbol. Some people were even eating it. Imagine having a little dash or sprinkle of ambergris in your, Taco Tuesday. But honestly, us fragrance people have always been a little bit strange. What really keeps me up at night though is just thinking about all the times that I've been hanging out at the beach, throwing rocks back into the ocean, and meanwhile, I could have actually been throwing ambergris back into the water, not realizing I could have paid for probably my entire college tuition. Insanity. Now, before anyone thinks about quitting their job to go and try to find ambergris at the beach, let me tell you that finding real ambergris is incredibly rare, like extremely rare. And because of that, modern perfumery, more often than not, has learned to use synthetic or fake ambergris in our actual perfumes. The most famous compound that is created that everyone is probably familiar with is ambroxan. If you've ever smelled Maison Francis Kurkdjian's Baccarat Rouge 540, or Le Labo's Another 13, or even Molecule Number 2, you have been smelling a perfume that has a heavy dose of ambroxan, which smells very similar to ambergris. And even though it's synthetic and fake and not the real thing, don't feel bad about that, because even if perfumers wanted to, they would not be able to make perfumes with ambergris at the type of scale that they would want to, simply because of how little of the actual natural resource that we have available. It also would just make most perfumes just way too expensive for most people to afford. So if ever you do see ambergris listed in one of your perfumes, think about the decades and decades of change and transformation that that particular material had to go through, from becoming just stinky, stinky whale vomit to something that smells incredible on your skin. Now, let's move on to talking about our last story of the day, which is the man who created what is arguably the most, if not one of the most, famous perfumes in history. We're talking about a fragrance that is over 100 years old, a fragrance that was worn by Marilyn Monroe herself, a fragrance that helped to change the fragrance industry forever, a fragrance that allegedly only came into existence because it was founded upon a mistake. This is the story of Chanel No. 5. Now, this story begins with a man who most people have honestly never even heard of. His name was Ernest Beau. And if you are a fragrance lover, there is an argument that he is perhaps the most important perfumer in history. Now, before he became the perfumer behind Chanel No. 5, Ernest was living in Russia, working in what could be said the highest position a perfumer could work in. He was creating perfumes for the Romanovs. The Romanovs were the last ruling family of Russia. Imagine being a perfumer who is making perfumes for literal kings and queens. That is crazy. So as you can imagine, life was going pretty well. And then history happened and everything was gone. Because around that time, we have the Russian Revolution. The Romanovs were expelled and their entire monarchy fell, along with the entire career that Ernest had worked so long to build. So instead of just, feeling sorry for himself and feeling pathetic, he decided to move to France to find more opportunity. And this is where things get interesting for our friend Ernest. He meets a woman named Coco Chanel, one of the most well-known fashion founders at that time for the House of Chanel. And at that time, Coco was looking to create her first perfume for Chanel. But what Coco told Ernest was that she did not want a perfume that smelled like everything else on the market, which at that point in time was flowers. Everything smelled like flowers. If you get a rose perfume, it smells like roses and water. You get jasmine, jasmine, and water. Everything was flower, flower, flower. Coco said that she wanted a perfume that smelled like a woman, which was quite the task at that time, a very bold request, because what exactly does a woman smell like? So Ernest went to work. Ernest took that to mean that she wanted something modern, something luxurious, something abstract, something that had never been smelt on the market before. Now, this is where one of the most famous stories that can't be completely verified, but where one of the most famous stories around Chanel No. 5 emerges. It's said that while he was working on creating different samples for Coco, his assistant accidentally added in way too many aldehydes into one particular sample. Aldehydes is an ingredient that when you add it to perfume, it creates a brightness, a sparkle, like a clean type of smell. But the amount that was added into this particular sample was way more than had ever been used in modern perfumery at that point in time. Imagine trying to bake cookies and you add like 5 times the amount of vanilla than most recipes call for, right? Usually that's enough to completely ruin the recipe. But this story does not end in ruin. Ernest and his assistant did not throw out that sample. They finished all of their work, all of their different offerings for Coco, and when they presented these samples to her, sample 1, sample 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, she immediately fell in love with which one? Number 5. And she also knew that the name was going to simply be Chanel number 5. Coco also had a little bit of a connection with the number 5. It was said that that was her lucky number. She would oftentimes only present her collections on the 5th day of the 5th month of every year. So the fact that the 5th sample was also her favorite, the one that had all of the extra aldehydes added in, seemed like it was just fate. What started out as a simple laboratory sample name became one of the most well-known household perfume names in history. Because Chanel number 5 was not just a perfume success, it became legendary. For decades, it has been the most sold perfume of all time. We're talking more than 100 years after this perfume was initially launched. Millions of bottles sold, billions of dollars in revenue. And the moment that arguably really pushed it into this legendary status was when Marilyn Monroe was being interviewed. And somebody asked her, "What do you like to wear to bed?" And she said, "Just a few drops of Chanel number 5. In an instant, that quote made Chanel number 5 one of the most sought after luxury perfumes on the market, because who would not want to smell like Marilyn Monroe, who was considered to be the most beautiful, seductive, sexy woman in that day and age? People still quote that line today, more than a century later. Now, in spite of all of its success, Chanel number 5 is still one of the most polarizing perfumes ever created when we're talking about the scent itself. Some people find it timeless, elegant, sophisticated, classic. Others smell it and think way too soapy, way too powdery, like some type of old vintage makeup bag. And honestly, if you ask me, I think both of those reactions are valid. Chanel number 5 was not created to smell modern in 2026. It was created to smell bold, unique, daring, and revolutionary in 1921. The fact that it's able to even sell some bottles, let alone a large amount of bottles in 2026, is a testament to how genius the creation is. And that's why I find Chanel number 5 to be so fascinating. Not because everybody loves it, because not everybody does, but because 100 years later, we are still talking and buying a perfume that was founded on a mistake. And for any product, not just a perfume, to stay culturally relevant like that after all this time deserves a lot more recognition, which is why, in my opinion, Ernest Beaux should be considered the most important perfumer to have ever lived. A Russian perfumer forced to rebuild his life after a revolution, who meets a fashion designer with a strange request, creates a handful of samples, and ends up creating the most famous perfume in history. Not bad for a guy who most people have never even heard of. Let me know what was the most interesting that you guys heard today, and I'll see you guys back next week for our next full deep dive episode.